This is the fable of the lion and the mouse.
A company of men on a ship in a storm wrecked on an enchanted island. Great success, great despair.
Personalities and internal conflicts and human conflicts.
Smuggling of gunpowder.
Biological warfare.
Slave rebellions.
The fortunes of ships and seamen.
In an age of great danger.
Secrecy protected by a bodyguard of lies.
Nests of spies in New York.
Understandings and deals.
The mouse that roars at the lion.
He that shall but turn up his eye and behold the lion, or shall but cast down his eye and see the mouse.
When the sun meets the sea at the start of the 16th century, ancient mariners turn their ships to the west and fill their sails with dreams of a new world. While in Europe, Aesop's fables first recount in print the tale of a lion and the story of a mouse.
Once when a lion was asleep, a little mouse began running up and down upon him. The lion placed his huge paw upon the mouse and opened his big jaws to swallow him. "Pardon, O king," cried the little mouse. "Forgive me this time, I shall never forget it. Who knows but what I may be able to do you a turn some of these days." The lion was so tickled at the idea of the mouse being able to help him that he lifted up his paw and let him go. Sometime after, the lion was caught in a trap. Just then the little mouse happened to pass by, and seeing the sad plight in which the lion was, sent up to him and soon gnawed away the ropes that bound the king of the beasts. "Was I not right?" said the little mouse. "I was able to help you this time."
This visionary fable travels a great distance in time to ring true for an unknown island, which would become a great outpost of the British Empire, the remote Atlantic island chain of Bermuda. And this ageless moral casts the fate of the lion, America, and the mouse, Bermuda, for the next 5 centuries. It all begins in the 1600s. The English colonial empire is expanding in size and power to compete with the Spanish. Driven by profit and adventure, the English seek out the New World, but war and starvation meet them on the great unknown continent, America. When Sir George Somers, admiral of the 3rd Supply, set sail for Jamestown, Virginia in 1609, every English colony along the East Coast in 20 years had failed, and most men had perished. This 3rd Supply is their last gamble to save the Virginia colonies, and more death is to come.
The Sea Venture was the flagship of this fleet. She had on board Sir George Somers, Sir Thomas Gates, who was going to go out and be governor of Virginia. And they sailed successfully across the Atlantic until, when it is said, they were some 10 days off the mouths of Chesapeake Bay.
The flagship of the fleet was caught in a
grip of a hurricane, and it was separated from the rest of the fleet.
The Sea Venture was battling for its life. And for 4 days and nights, the passengers and crew desperately pumped continuously to keep the vessel afloat. And on the verge of sinking, when they all had pretty much given up,
They were drinking toasts to each other to a meeting in a better world. They were preparing to die. And Summers looked up and out, and he saw land, and he realized that it was the Bermudas. They headed in for a beach and banged over a reef and then fixed hard between two reefs. They got everyone ashore.
in thinking about the story as William Strachey, Gates's secretary, narrates it in his famous account, first you were in this terrible storm battling for your life, desperate and afraid. And then with great joy you would see Bermuda on the horizon and realize you were saved. But they believe they're on this terrible Isle of Devils. So really these people see heaven and hell.
The Devil's Islands are feared and voided of all sea travelers alive. Yet it had pleased our merciful God to make even this hideous and hated place both the place of our safety and means of our deliverance. William Strachey.
These very words eventually reach the ears of Shakespeare and inspire him to pen The Tempest, placing the story of a tiny archipelago onto the world stage. Or as he writes famously, all the world is a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances. And one man in his time plays many parts.
Long live Dixie. Long live Dixie.
His acts being 7 ages. And so begins Act 1 of The Lion and the Mouse, with the fateful shipwreck upon a mystical island marking the beginning of a brave new world.
My child will live to be born, but delivered out of a tempest to start life on this deserted island, now part of the English New World. This island of devils. God, tell us, will we find solace here?
The story has it that sooner or later they began to have a different perception of the island.
They discover Bermuda is such a nice place that many of them, in fact, don't want to leave.
The air is temperate, and this country so abundantly fruitful. An island truly without the devils we had grown so accustomed to. They filled our expectation, and what to find but flowers and fruit and a reprieve from the horror of that floundering sea venture.
Out of hell's fury becomes heaven. To be blown onto this isle must be God's true providence. Bermuda, how you will haunt our survival and test our true mission.
They were no longer on the ship. They weren't in Virginia, so therefore, who was the boss? Legally, the boss.
They appealed to a higher law, to God's law.
If God had led you to this island, then why should we leave this island?
Sir Thomas Gates is the governor-designate of Jamestown and has assumed authority. But Summers is the admiral, and it was true, it was he who first took sight of the island that led us here. There's a little confusion. We're not sure who to listen to.
I imagine for all commanders, the nightmare scenario was having a group of men, or in this case men and women, some of whom no longer accepted your authority. You've got some larger-than-life characters. On board was a man who probably wasn't terribly well known, John Rolfe, and his wife, but would become very well known for his experiments with tobacco in Virginia. It's thought that the tobacco that he grew, that the seeds came from Trinidad. But there's also a theory that there may have been some tobacco growing on Bermuda. And also, among the passengers on the Sea Venture were a very early group of Puritans.
Stephen Hopkins tried to foment a mutiny for people who would prefer to stay on Bermuda rather than get to work and build a ship to take them on to Virginia.
We are, all of us, agents of the Virginia Company. And we must continue our mission to the New World to stake the Kingdom of England's claim to the land that will lead us around the world to the South Seas. Therefore, we must build a new ship that will take us from here and deliver us to Jamestown. We shall call her the Deliverance, our Deliverance.
But Sir Thomas, what of this place? Surely, although I've never been, Jamestown is not the fair and well of this land that we have been cast upon by God himself.
All of us were chosen as honored passengers on board the flagship. Our survival and your temptation were sent to test us, to test our privilege and honor to finish our journey. You must continue. It is my order, as it is Governor Gates's wish.
And so it was to be. We're not to stay here. We're to leave these roseate beaches and mild conditions and land of plenty for the desolation of Jamestown, where pestilence and death reign. My husband and I fear to disagree with Gates, but our hearts lie where Hopkins speaks.
I am a godly man, and it was God's will to crash our ship upon these rocks. It is our destiny to stay here. I will not go with Gates. Gates is the governor of Jamestown, and this is Bermuda. No man should be made to go against his will, since all authority was lost when the Sea Venture was wrecked.
I'll stay if I can to give this child a better life, but my husband and I dare not speak openly against our leader.
How dare you rebuke my authority? You will be left on this island indeed, in punishment for your insult and for your disregard of duty and purpose.
He was condemned to death by Gates.
For electing treasonous ramblings, this man is hereby sentenced to death.
But Strachey's account says he did make
Yes, please,
much
Sir Gates.
moan.
Please show pity this once for my wife and my children. They will be ruined without me. Spare my neck. Spare my neck for them. Imagine what will happen to them in the New World, in our English Virginia.
We must not kill him. Think of the morale. It could lead to massive mutiny, and we will lose our heads if a mass retaliates. He's popular in the group. Think of our mission.
At the same time, Summers, we must keep order.
Please, spare my life.
You will be pardoned, Hopkins, but only once. And you will be on deck when we head the main vessel out to Jamestown. And I must see evidence of your repentance. You will head work on the main vessel.
Yes. Thank you, Sir Thomas. Thank you.
He went on to Jamestown, and from Jamestown got back to England, and then later went out on the Mayflower and was a trouble to the Pilgrim Fathers too. He didn't want to obey their rules. They were not his rules. Gates ordered guards to be set on the supply tents.
Within all of the conspiracy, daily life of the castaways continues.
We will call her Bermuda in honor of our salvation.
The rebellion also keeps its place as a part of life.
The way they're trying to resist is to either steal tools to prevent the vessels from being built, or to deliberately slow the pace of work on building the replacement vessels. And Henry Payne, who's recognized as a gentleman, really contemplates a coup.
That foolish man, Henry Payne. It was his only duty to guard the building site and this settlement, and instead he refused and told off Governor Gates.
He said the governor could kiss his ass. The governor decided to try him.
I fear for his fate.
Gates needs to meet this with force to show that he has the power of life and death.
You have been brought forth to answer charges of negligence of duty, which is also treason and conspiracy. What do you have to answer?
I did nothing. I refuse your punishment.
I have just now heard that Payne conspired with others unknown to steal provisions and set up their own camp on another island. Sir George won't be able to help him now.
Your fate was in your hands. For such a grievance to the governor, and therefore to the Virginia Company and the English crown, you are hereby sentenced to death.
As our Secretary Strachey will soon immortalize, Henry Payne's life and the sun set at the same time. My dear sweet child is dead. I know I'm not long for this world. My husband. How he looks at me before I am to die. But how I know now Jamestown is his place, for he is destined to take another wife and live out his life's meaning with an Indian princess, and save England's reign of the New World.
10 months after a hurricane leaves the Sea Venture for dead, a pair of ships sail up the James River, bringing the lost flock triumphant, and with them redemption from starvation, pillage, and the ruin of Virginia.
They discovered that the place was in a shambles, that there had been a dreadful starving time.
They encountered probably their worst nightmare. An Indian war sprang up, and they found James Fort falling down. They found these 60 survivors who had to resort to cannibalism. They had actually dug up graves and eaten bodies. One man killed his wife and salted her and ate her, for which he was executed. And Gates arrives, think of it going from paradise to hell, and the contrast could not have been sharper, leaving a rich and bountiful Bermuda and to arrive in Virginia in the midst of this war.
The awareness dawns on them that the shipwreck was salvation from a more certain death, and they are delivered upon Jamestown for a higher purpose.
I think it was a shock. I think there were probably many on board that, if they'd had the chance, would have told Gates, well, we told you so.
Somers and Gates managed to keep nearly all the remaining settlers alive. But as they looked at the situation, they thought that they could not maintain the settlement. They would have to give it up. So they set off down the James River again with the 2 Bermuda vessels and 2 others that were there.
At that moment in time, there was no English America. The Indian chief won, and the greatest empire is not to be known. Virginia is no more.
And this brings us to perhaps one of the great turnarounds in all of American history.
The fourth supply was already on its way.
Before they could get out of the James River, they encountered Lord Delaware coming up the river with new relief supplies and new settlers. And they all turned back. And from that time on, there never was a time when there was not an English settlement in the New World. So I like to say that the supplies from Bermuda saved the infant United States from strangulation at birth.
The wreck and redemption of the Sea Avenger castaways, as they said at the time, was a major event in world history. The good news of Bermuda helped save the Virginia Company.
I think it matters that the English remained in Virginia. I think that has consequences not only for the future history of English and then British America, but also ultimately for the United States.
The English needed to have a secure place from which to leverage their position in the New World. And they identified that as Bermuda.
George Somers felt that Bermuda was was a good place to settle. The colonists from Virginia went back to England and petitioned to colonize Bermuda.
Colonization came in 1612. The Virginia Company's charter was extended so they could include Bermuda.
For a short time, the island takes the name Virginiola, a territory of America, until the Bermuda Company splits from Virginia in 1615, becoming the Somers Isles, in honor of Sir George. It continues to aid the infant colony on its ascendancy, but never again would Bermuda be part of America. These 2 sister colonies of the Atlantic became simultaneously founded in the institution of democracy and the institution of slavery. From the beginnings of the English New World, freedom and statehood take divergent paths.
It's pretty certain that the first Africans in British America arrive in Bermuda, not Virginia.
About 1616, the Bermuda Company asks the captain of the Edwin to go down to the Savage Isles for the purposes of finding, among other things, individuals that could be enslaved. The Edwin arrives back in 1616.
I was brought to this native wild island as the only one. Am I a slave or servant? Regardless, I am subject to work for these men. My labor is not my own. I claim my place in history as the first man to settle this island of this race. My children will be born and struggle again for freedom and equality, and make this island home.
Meanwhile, in Virginia, one of the Sea Venture castaways notes the beginning of slavery in Jamestown.
John Rolfe describes a story of a Portuguese slave ship out of Angola in the summer of 1619. Pretty close to its destination in the Bay of Campeche, is attacked by 2 privateers. Those 2 privateers took a number of the slaves. John Rolfe describes their arrival. 20 and odd Negroes coming to the James River.
Headed by Daniel Elfrith, he brought the surplus of those slaves to Bermuda, in a sense creating a connection between the two.
Soon a ship called the Treasurer will find Bermuda shores, carrying a cargo of Angolan people sold into slavery, some remaining in Jamestown to become the first African Americans. The rest make the long journey back across the Atlantic to join me as Bermuda's first slaves, to toil in homes, to labor in the fields, to fish in the waters, to become the backbone of this colony.
Slavery became an entrenched feature of Bermudian society, particularly after the 1640s. In the 1640s you had Indians who were brought in, but more so you had a definite increase in black slaves who were brought in from the West Indies.
The first African arrivals in many colonies, highly skilled, multicultural, multilingual, knowledgeable individuals, it's really the expertise they bring.
We teach these Englishmen the skills of survival that will head them well through the centuries to come. Survival at land and at sea, and give their country self-reliance, the same human independence they will deny me.
The first Africans in Bermuda very much corresponds to the success that the colonists have finally in curing tobacco.
The rapid growth and success of the island colony proves to be a strain on its resources. The threat of starvation becomes the thorn in its side for the next several centuries. This need becomes the mother of invention.
Bermuda, given the small size, can't shift to an economy of scale. So really, even by the 1630s, Bermuda was growing crowded and people were leaving the island to seek their fortunes on new colonies for a vast Atlantic full of opportunities. So the great tension in the 17th century was Bermudians who wanted to go to sea and develop alternate trades, and the company which wanted to continue to grow tobacco, which is something the company could tax and profit from. Ultimately, it culminated in a huge legal court case, and the company was abolished in 1684. And then Bermudians were free to build their ships and use the Atlantic as their hinterland.
This freedom begins the maritime revolution, which shapes Bermuda's ever-changing role in the Atlantic world. White and black Bermudians have equal hand in the creation of this trade, but blacks will not be truly free for another 150 years.
There's this very radical and seismic shift to a maritime economy where they become the carriers for the Western Atlantic, connecting English colonies. Bermudians shifted to the sea at just the right time.
Blacks became sailors, they became fishermen, pilots. They learned to navigate the reefs, the waters, and became famous for it. It was, in a sense, a means of independence.
Black Bermudian sailors were really quite distinctive in a world where at least 90% of the slaves in America were engaged in agricultural labor.
Our fates became entwined as slave and master, through the sea and the earth, eventually to evolve into one, One island amid the currents of the sea and the politics of the world.
Bermudians take to the ocean as both privateers and pirates, a lawlessness which keeps Bermuda in the grips of the world around them.
The 18th century was a period of almost continuous war. Really, from 1689 to 1815, various European powers were almost continuously fighting with each other, and those fights played out on the shipping lanes of the Atlantic.
Bermuda's location in the middle of the Atlantic is absolutely critical. Having a port where you could actually call on and seek shelter or ship repair was critical to the transatlantic trade that allowed the United States colonies, at that time colonies, to survive.
The outbreak of the American Revolution posed a fundamental challenge to Bermuda as it had evolved around a maritime economy. Bermudians are really radiating out all over the Americas. There are family connections with which to do business. But when half of the British Empire goes to war with the other half, then family loyalties are stretched and you have some real hard choices to make.
Over the course of time, Bermudians have learned to be quite cagey about their relationship with the outside world. During the American Revolutionary War, there were no doubt people who sympathized with the colonists. There were many who did not. A number of Bermudians moved to South Carolina or Virginia, such as the Tucker family, and these connections complicated the relationship between Bermuda and what became the United States.
Colonel Henry Tucker, the great patriarch of the family, had 4 sons, one of whom in effect lucked in. He married the daughter, Frances, of the governor at the time, and moved up here to St. George's, where he became the secretary to the governor, a very privileged position. The other son, St. George Tucker, he was directed towards William and Mary College, the second oldest university in America.
I think it best I know nothing. I cannot begin the tear between country and family loyalty.
Colonel Henry was certainly one of the leading merchants of the time. So they were a very powerful family. When the American Revolution broke, St. George Tucker had just graduated. The other side of his loyalty pulled him home in 1775. Before leaving, he made it known to Thomas Jefferson, who was very closely aligned with George Wythe, his professor, that to his knowledge there was a generous supply of gunpowder in Bermuda. Bermudians were really torn and I think exhibited a notorious pragmatism in trying to find a kind of middle ground. When you live on an island, you can't afford to live by high principles.
Fighting broke out at Lexington and Concord, and the American Revolutionary War got underway. An embargo was placed on all exports of food to British colonies.
Realizing that Bermuda is going to face starvation, the Tucker family and many other pro-American Bermudians send a delegation to Philadelphia to plead for an exclusion.
The Continental Congress said no, but a committee, apparently Benjamin Franklin as one member, said that there was a large supply of gunpowder on the island and that if this were shipped to the American forces, then they might change.
Come now, brother. We will starve. For what? Loyalty? Will your children understand when there is no meat or bread? What will happen to this place when hunger ravishes? What will neighbor do to neighbor?
You quiet yourself, St. George.
Ask yourself, dear son, Henry Jr., what is the price of your loyalty?
What you ask of me is grave, Father. I think it best I know nothing. Don't you forget that one small word, duty.
I, Colonel Henry Tucker, remain a British subject, and one who wishes to live and continue as a subject of the King and not starve. It's a question of survival.
We respect your wishes. We also ask and expect you to uphold your loyalty to this family and invoke silence on the matter.
So, you satisfied?
Very well.
I can't hear what they're saying, but I can see trouble brewing. I am going to find out what is going on in my family before it's too late.
Get me some tea, please. Thank you.
Is something bothering you, mistress?
No. No. Now leave me alone.
I must not leave, mistress. Master Tucker wishes that I remain in the room and follow any orders that you may have, but I am not to leave your company.
Then you must obey this order. Not to utter a word of what you see today to my dear husband. He must know nothing of what I do today. A receipt for 5 longboats. Why, what would he want for those? And signed in the debt of father-in-law Colonel Henry. He is most certainly a rebel. Along with that most unscrupulous brother, St. George.
I thought you'd be out today, Mrs. Tucker.
Oh, no, Mr. Tucker. I decided to stay in and catch up on correspondence.
Well, I'm busy with St. George's visit.
Well, now, perhaps that your brother St. George is visiting, he might have some time to take his sister-in-law out for a ride in a boat on such a summer's day. Would you happen to have any such vessel
Now, you
that...
know we have no such boats. All ours are with the ships out at sea and trade.
I know nothing of the sort.
Well, I have business to attend to. Perhaps you can ask St. George yourself.
Oh, well, the heat's getting to me, so perhaps I'll move into the study and write a note.
Very well.
Fetch me my quill and paper.
Dearest Father, I dread to write this to you most swiftly, but last night I overheard the most curious things. They don't all add up, but I also found a receipt for several boats, which my dear husband denies possession of. And the receipt itself was in the name of my own father-in-law, that rebel Colonel Henry Tucker of Somerset. And I heard talk of starvation and rebellion spoken in hushed tones last evening. Please heed this, but do not respond, as that may compromise your position. Your daughter, Frances. Send this to Governor Brewer immediately. It's of the utmost importance.
Yes, madame. Dearest Father, I dread to write this letter to you most swiftly, but last night I have overheard the most curious things. She was the one who has taught me to read, and only so my eyes could come upon this letter. It was to be. I must make Master Tucker aware of its words.
What's so urgent?
It's Mistress Tucker. She knows of our plans.
How? That's impossible.
She's written this letter and asked me to deliver it.
Well, we have to rewrite it. Let's see.
Dearest Father, all is well here on Water Street. The weather is pleasing, and I wanted to write to you to ask you formally if you would be kind enough to have my dear husband and myself over for tea sometime this week, as Henry's brother St. George is visiting from abroad, and he would very much like an audience with you. Henry was intending to ask, but felt you would take umbrage, as we all know St. George has different leanings than you. And please do not mention this letter again, and never to Henry that I had asked this of you. Your loving daughter, Frances.
I am loyal to my master. I know that this is dangerous, but that note would have harmed us all. My children would have starved. But Master Tucker is very smart and powerful, as you see. We must all keep this secret together.
On the night of August the 14th, a group of men broke into the roof of the little magazine. They opened the door and rolled out barrels of gunpowder.
They rolled the barrels across Governor Brewer's property and put it on rowboats. and then they were ferried to 2 American vessels, which then sailed off to Charleston and to Philadelphia to deliver this powder.
All the while, Governor Brewer sleeps soundly, assured that the colony's gunpowder is lying secure in the magazine.
After the plot was revealed, the British governor, of course, tried to get to the bottom of it, but they really ran circles around him.
He issued a proclamation offering a large reward for the recapture of the gunpowder, for information leading to the arrest of the people who'd stolen it.
Information from the highest authorities. We have reason to believe that there are certain rebels aiding the rebels.
He even offers freedom to any Bermudian slave who can give information on what happens.
Weapons and gunpowder.
But Bermudians remain united in their silence. Governor Brewer had just received word that one of his sons had been killed in the Battle of Bunker Hill and that another son had been wounded. Then Bermudians engaged in this audacious act of treason, stealing the powder. And Governor Brewer found himself alone.
The House of Assembly met, and therefore they set up a committee to investigate the theft of the gunpowder. The committee heard evidence from a gentleman who lived at the flats, saying that a member of the Tucker family had come to him and asked him if they could borrow a whaleboat for the night of August the 14th. But they came to the conclusion that the word of one man could not be taken against so prestigious a family as the Tuckers. And therefore, officially, we don't know who stole the gunpowder.
St. George Tucker went out of his way to make an alibi for the evening of the raid, to be seen walking on the streets of St. George's in the company of people in illuminated light, so that he could point to the fact that he was not guilty.
The need for gunpowder was significant, and Bermuda had British gunpowder. To be able to spirit that away and for it to find its way into the hands of George Washington probably was one of the most significant things that happened in the early part of the war.
The gunpowder plot itself was an example of Bermudians taking matters into their own hands. The perpetrators were guilty of treason, but no one was ever brought to trial. They got away with it, essentially.
Bermudians do quite well for themselves out of the American Revolution. Bermudians not only avoid deadly famine, but in fact profit in many ways from the wartime experience.
Beyond the loyalties of any country, Bermudians feel entitled to further their own means. In 1777, under the American flag, Bermuda is attacked, the only time in her history.
In war, there are many conflicting situations. So regardless of what was being negotiated with the Continental Congress, that didn't stop hostilities from continuing.
2 American privateers appeared off Somerset, and they obviously knew the channels and got up to Wreck Hill, where a battery had been established. They occupied Somerset more or less for a couple of days. They threw the guns overboard from the battery, and then they sailed away again. They were under the command of a Captain Morgan, who was a Bermudian, and it is thought by some that the black cloud that hangs over Bermuda in summertime and is called Morgan's Cloud.
Americans early appreciated Bermuda's strategic location. Bermuda in American hands as a base for either Continental Navy or American privateers could inflict great damage on British shipping. The United States and France had plotted a joint operation to take Bermuda. And they had even gathered ships and forces, but who was going to pay for this operation became a bone of contention, and then it was ultimately abandoned.
In 1780, Bermudian Captain B. Joel sends an attack plan to the American Board of War. A map of St. George's where residents supporting America are marked with a cross to aid an invading party. It never happened. As we end Act 3, the Mouse is left as a small and vulnerable British territory, isolated from the Empire. As the 19th century dawns, Bermuda is to become the prime focus for an empire looking to bolster its influence in the Atlantic. Aware of foreign interest in the island, the British begin one of the largest fortification programs in recent history.
After the American Revolution, Bermuda became very important indeed as a means of providing diplomatic leverage when Britain and the United States were quarreling.
The British established Bermuda as the Gibraltar of the West because, first of all, they didn't want America to take over Bermuda.
Bermuda was the linchpin, the safe base between these two halves of British America. So making Bermuda usable to the British military was critical.
As the military age of a small island boomed, Bermuda would become the center of an important British attack on America.
Open warfare broke out between the United States and Britain, what became known as the War of 1812.
I've seen it convincingly argued as the Second American Revolution. America basically picked a fight with Great Britain, and Bermuda becomes the staging ground for a massive amphibious invasion.
A fleet of ships carrying 5,000 soldiers and Marines sailed from Bermuda.
Americans knew an invasion was coming, but they had no idea where it was going to arrive. They were waiting for the axe to fall.
The British invade Washington and attack Baltimore.
They burn the nation's capital and run President Madison out of the White House. So it was a tremendous sort of injury to national pride that their celebrated new national capital would fall so easily to British forces.
They besieged Baltimore, and it was here that the British took prisoner of war for about 3 days, a man called Francis Scott Key. And it was on a Royal Naval battleship from Bermuda that Key watched the bombardment of Baltimore. It is on that ship that he penned the words of the Star-Spangled Banner, the American national anthem. They had a second mission to the attack, and that was to encourage American slaves to leave America and seek refuge on British warships. About 700 American slaves from the Chesapeake area, including men, women, and children, arrived in Bermuda. Eventually, the British decided they would settle these 700 Americans in Trinidad.
As America fights a perilous fight, many men meet unnecessary ends for a war that could not be won. A seaman's death in Bermuda becomes a symbol for the changing relationship between the lion and the mouse.
The War of 1812 went over by several weeks, but this was not known in the United States, and therefore 2 ships engaged in a battle. Unfortunately, several people were killed, and the American ship was brought into Bermuda as a prize. Aboard was a young midshipman who'd been wounded, but eventually died and was buried in St. Peter's churchyard.
St. Peter's Church continues today as a monument to the island's history from 1612. As the first congregation of Parliament in 1620, and the last resting place of many important figures in the centuries that have passed. These include embattled Governor Brewer of the Gunpowder Plot, who is buried mysteriously under the floorboards, and Midshipman Richard Sutherland Dale.
He was the last casualty of the 1812 war, and when he died here, Commodore Dale came to Bermuda and laid a marble wreath on his son's grave, thanking the people of St. George's for their courtesy and kindness to his son. And it's really significant to me because that was the last hostility between Britain and America, and we've been friends and allies since that point, and it's kind of a monument to all of that as far as I'm concerned.
Although there is peace between nations, slavery remains an injustice within. There is a long history of notable resistance movements by slaves to overthrow their captors. As the mouse evolves to keep up with the times, change is upon this small island.
Every 10, 20 years you had slave rebellions. There would be conspiracies and someone would be found and tried and executed or exiled. The importance of slave rebellions is simply that, no, they did not sit down and accept their lot.
Sally Bassett is remembered for her act of rebellion after she is burnt at the stake for plotting to poison her family's white masters.
The famous story is that when they looked at her ashes, there were the purple flowers. And the famous saying of "it's as hot as a Sally Bassett day" has come down from that famous story.
She will be seen as a hero in the sense that she was probably the only Bermudian who actually took her opposition to slavery to the fullest extent possible.
Another Bermudian hero in the abolitionist movement takes the cruelties of slavery to an international audience.
Mary Prince was a slave in Bermuda, and she ended up going to England and testifying before the Anti-Slavery Society in Britain, and was the first black female recorded statement on the ills of slavery in 1831.
She was an abolitionist, and she would join that movement once she went to Britain. Throughout her experiences, relate a process of abuse and ill treatment that became a description of cause célèbre. Her story became very powerful voices against slavery.
In Bermuda, the economics of slavery were no longer working really by the turn of the 19th century.
These words mark the year 1834. The Rubicon is passed. The step from slavery to freedom has been taken, a step which for confidence and honest boldness stands unequaled in the annals of the world. The Royal Gazette. Emancipation is celebrated in churches around the island. Bermuda's slaves are free at last.
By emancipation, it was about 50% black population and 50% white population. Most slaves ended up working doing what they did the day before when they were slaves. They continued to work as pilots, as shipbuilders.
As everyone knows, granting slaves their freedom was not the same thing as granting blacks equal rights.
After emancipation, the slaves still worked for their masters, but with the knowledge that they were free and their children were free. And the friendly society strived to feed them and clothe them, house them and employ them, and give them the freedom of choice, and to pursue the true liberty, equality.
After emancipation, you saw the friendly societies really grow and prosper.
The friendly societies in Bermuda was, I'll say, the bedrock of the black community.
I'm a member of Alexandrina Lodge number 1026. That is one of the lodges of the Grand United Order of Oddfellows. There were a number of barriers which black people encountered in society. But the lodges did give them a sense of belonging, a sense of self-esteem, a place where they could take leadership roles, being a part of the fabric of Bermudian societies.
Less than a year after emancipation, the friendly societies play an important role in the fate of an American merchant ship caught in an Atlantic maelstrom and blown to Bermuda. On board are American slaves who had come to reside in Bermuda with their own legacy of slavery and of freedom.
The Enterprise was going from Virginia to South Carolina, but a storm arose and drew the ship off course. The captain of the ship, Elliot Smith, he said, "We'll come ashore." The people on the island, they saw the ship coming in and they rowed out to meet it.
And discovered the nature of the Enterprise's cargo. Slavery had ended in Bermuda.
One of the friendly societies intervened and petitioned the government to allow them to be offered their freedom.
Thank you, Madame, for seeing me at such urgent and short notice.
Ship in our waters.
Now, if we, the Friendly Society, petition the court, and with the good word of members of society like yourself, I'm sure that we can convince the court to at least hear our plea. Then they'll realize that those slaves, once in Bermuda waters, are free. Free to remain as residents in Bermuda. Imagine, a boy of 6 to leave his last chance in Bermuda and then be sold into this vicious industry. We have to do what we can.
You have my word.
A document was sent to the captain which required the captain and all of the slaves to come ashore. Of the slaves that came, a good 60% of them were children under the age of 12, 13.
On this day, February 18th, 1835, the court will resume and hear the case of the brigantine vessel, the Enterprise, over the matter of her cargo. The court finds plainly and simply for the Crown, and rules that the inalienable right of freedom be bestowed upon these men, women, and children from the point of their entry here in Bermuda. Step forward, young lady. Your name is Mahaley Warfield. Yes.
You came in the brig Enterprise as a slave, and it is my duty to inform you that in this country you are free as any white person. And should it be your wish to remain here, you will be protected by the authorities. Do you therefore wish to remain and be a free person, or continue your voyage and remain a slave?
I, Mahaley Warfield, wish to remain here and be free. Free.
With the power vested in these courts under the crown of His Majesty, King William IV, you are hereby a free person and will remain on these islands as a resident and subject of the King.
If you could see the joy and wonderment on their faces, unawed now by the perhaps worse than frowns of their late oppressor.
Your name is Ned Poston? Now, you are only 6 years old. Well, is there anyone else of your family here who can speak for you?
No.
I'm sorry?
No.
No. Well, do you understand that you are being given the choice between freedom and slavery?
Yes, free.
Well, hold on. Now, should it be your wish to remain here and be free, or continue with the brigantine Enterprise and sold and held into service as a slave?
I want to remain here and be free.
You are one Matilda Ridgely.
Yes, Your Honor.
Do you wish to stay in Bermuda and be free, or continue on board the Enterprise?
I would like to continue on the Enterprise.
Do you realize that you have chosen slavery over freedom for yourself and your children?
Yes, Your Honor. I do choose slavery.
Very well, so be it.
I wish to be free. Please.
We would like to be free. Thank you.
I do not wish to return to that awful ship. I want to be free.
I thank you and wish to be free.
I believe I speak for most of us when I say, from the bottom of my heart, I wish to remain in Bermuda and finally have my freedom.
Oh, if only other nations would follow the glorious example of the British people in doing away with the odious system of slavery.
I hereby end this court session with the happy pronouncement of freedom for these slaves. I must take it upon myself to comment that none too much can be said in praise of the Friendly Society, who, sir, have generously exerted themselves to rescue so many of their fellow beings from cruel thraldom.
Thank you, Your Honor. It is our duty to help our own in this period and into the future. I attest that they will not forget the charity and justice that you have afforded them.
By the power vested in me, this court proceeding is adjourned.
So the ship had to sail away without its stolen cargo. And there are people living in Bermuda today who can trace their origins back to the Enterprise.
Haley, she was a very naughty little girl. Nobody wanted to keep her. That's my great-grandmother.
I guess my mother must have told us. We always knew there was something called Children of the Enterprise. the Friendly Society stayed in our lives.
Yeah, I owe my education to the Grand United Order of Oddfellows. They gave scholarships, you know.
Even now, they send money monthly to people who were members. And my mother receives money for her sister. It's comforting. They keep reminding us of who we are, where we came from.
The enterprise was a crucible, a catalyst that brought about a particular period of time in Bermuda's life, and within the bigger picture of international stage, Bermuda played a major part.
6 years later, a slave ship, the Amistad, mutinies, and the fate of the slaves on board comes to trial. In the United States, still 30 years from emancipation, and the mouse aids the lion once again.
The Amistad was a ship that ended up in the United States, in New York, and the argument there was that the blacks on board were never slaves, that they were free. And it was illegal to bring free persons into the United States for slavery. Roger Baldwin in the Amistad case was asking the United States courts simply to recognize the freedom of these people and not enslave them. And so he used the Bermuda cases as an example. What's interesting is that the Bermuda courts were prepared to go far further in their decision of recognizing the freedoms of black people than the United States court was asked to even do.
I hereby end this court session with the happy pronouncement of freedom for these slaves.
The Lion and the Mouse puts Bermuda too much as a junior partner. Or if you were to retell that fable, you would have a lion cub and a mouse, and that lion cub would grow and grow and grow, and the mouse would sort of be pulling out thorns constantly over the course of that lion's life.
In the second half of the 19th century, America becomes distracted by their own internal conflict between the slave-owning South and the industrial North. By 1860, a new nation is born, the Confederacy of States, and here begins the American Civil War. The land of the free is now the land of battle and bloodshed.
The Civil War was about slavery and about arguments over slavery and the place of slavery in national politics.
Really, it was about, in my view, the North wanted to have free and mobile labor to work in the factories.
The Civil War was obviously a very difficult period for my country, a horrible time of internecine bloodshed.
Although Queen Victoria declared that Britain was neutral in this war in 1861, local sentiment in Bermuda, and particularly in St. George, was certainly in favor of the South.
Bermuda is again drawn into the war on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line. The Union declares a blockade of southern ports, hoping to strangle their enemy's economy. And soon the mouse begins to benefit from the miseries of its closest neighbor.
Bermudians traded with Southerners, not so much for ideological reasons, but as merchants. Bermuda and Nassau in the Bahamas become staging ports from where fast steamers could run in and out through the northern blockade, bringing needed war material in and leaving with cotton, which was used to pay for that war material.
The Civil War was another example, another period in Bermuda's history where Bermuda really stepped up onto the world stage and played an important role, again because of its geographical position and the willingness of Bermudians to break with the official line and help their neighbors.
In Bermuda, all the black people were free. In the southern United States, most were in slavery. However, this did not stop Bermudians from taking advantage of the situation and working one side against the other to make money to increase their economic livelihood. The Confederate agent in Bermuda was Norman Walker, who with his wife did a very effective job of supplying the Confederate blockade runners, conducting diplomacy to keep the warring factions, if you will, in St. George's at peace.
You look divine, Mrs. Georgiana Walker.
Well, thank you there, Mr. Norman Walker, agent to the soon-to-be victorious Confederate States.
They lived in St. George's in the house we now call Banana Manor. And Georgiana Walker kept a diary of her time in Bermuda, talking about celebrating Southern victories reported by the newspaper.
We have been greatly blessed in the constant news which we have had from the Confederacy. Our mails have been almost regular as those from England.
Both the North and the South had agents here in Bermuda. The U.S. consul was Charles Allen, who found himself pretty much alone and often quite scared in a colony that was heavily Southern in its sympathies.
There is no doubt that Major Walker, who styles himself Confederate States Agent, is receiving goods from New York by most every vessel. Your faithful servant, U.S. Consul General Charles Allen.
He did the best he could to gather intelligence and to forward on to Washington and the North what vessels were coming and going. The Confederate government and Southerners cleverly skirted the issue of slavery. They did not say we are fighting to defend the institution of slavery. And I suppose Bermudians who were pursuing business with the South could essentially trade with them, not necessarily in their own minds to prop up a slave nation. It's a contradiction.
Many of the crews of the blockade runners were black Bermudian mariners. Black crews and white crews who worked on the blockade runners made a lot of money doing so.
It was a wild time. It was a boom town. There was fortunes to be made if you took the risk and you were willing to work. Whether you believed in the cause you were helping perhaps didn't figure into the equation.
Bermudian merchants have always had an eye to money to be made off of war.
Fitting out the cargo of the Cornubia, one of the blockade runners, just on one voyage might involve 70,000 pounds worth of goods. So every time one of these vessels ran into or out of Bermuda, some of these merchants were making the equivalent of at least a year's salary.
There is only really one significant event that indicates that black Bermudians were aware of the meaning of the war, and that was when a group of longshoremen refused to load some of the blockade runners, and there was a strike. And this was very unusual for Bermuda.
Pay for them to feed their children.
Norman Walker managed to recruit some white people.
What is the trouble on the docks?
As the dock workers, they refused to load the ships, and I spent all day recruiting men from the country to come in and do their jobs. Well, we solved it in the end. It was more a show of indignation, a privilege their relatives do not enjoy in the South. Well, I'd like to propose a toast to the health and success of our gallant president.
Our president. Our president.
Long live Dixie.
Long live Dixie.
I do believe that through God's providence we shall pass through this war safely and become a great nation, purified through suffering.
Well, that's a fine sentiment, Mrs. Blackburn. Thank you.
Remember, it's 3 cheers for the war and the success of the blockade runners.
Hip hip. Hurrah! Hip hip. Hurrah! Hip hip.
Hurrah!
Dearest wife, the present state of things makes it very unpleasant for me here just now, as there is a very bitter feeling against everything and everybody belonging to the Union. There is a session vessel in port with British colors, and Southern steamers are more plentiful than ever.
Charles Allen was in place to protest some of the gross abuses of British neutrality. He was partly a spy and partly a diplomatic agent.
So, tell me, Mr. Walker, what has that rascal Charles Allen been up to lately?
Only the regular thorns in my side, as they say. I assume you're referring to the latest standoff between that Wilkes again and our blockade runners. You know, if Charles Allen isn't careful, the British will enter this war. If their trade is interrupted on this fair island, they forget their place.
An enthusiastic commander named Charles Wilkes nearly, perhaps, brought Great Britain into war against the United States. And he brought several warships to Bermuda and were patrolling off Bermuda's shores, trying to intercept inbound blockade runners. And blockading a nation's port is itself an act of war.
Admiral Wilkes, who was a bit of a madman, complained that he had not been saluted by the guns in the forts. So this was duly arranged. And Wilkes replied with a salute from his flagship. He was unable to maintain a blockade of the port, which he had tried to do. And this caused a lot of diplomatic fuss between England and the States. But nothing came of it.
My predecessor, who was of course a Union representative, was very active both diplomatically and militarily, and many credit him with actually averting Great Britain's entry into that war.
One of Charles Allen's only comrades is Joseph Hayne Rainey, a freed black from South Carolina. Rainey escapes the Confederacy for Bermuda, where he becomes a barber and possibly a Union spy during the war between the states.
He learned a lot in Bermuda. He struggled with his education. He had people who came to his barber shop help him with his exercise books and seems to have learned a good deal.
Joseph Haynes Rainey was a brilliant man, no doubt about it. He did extremely well. His wife was a good seamstress, probably the best around.
Georgiana Walker had a dress made by Madame Suzette, who apparently was really Mrs. Rainey. And because of the nature of the situation, Mrs. Walker had a friend go and try it on.
This is for Mrs. Walker for a party. It would be a much finer dress if she came to get measured herself. Why do these inequalities exist even here?
We'll be struggling for the rest of our lives, for ourselves and for others. You know, as I do, in your heart, that it is both equality and freedom we must argue and fight for. The Negro will not rest until he gets his rights.
The dress was a success as far as Mrs. Walker was concerned, and she went to dinner at Government House in it. This was a high point for the Confederacy in Bermuda. And she says, my train, I guess, swept more or less a quarter of a mile behind me. But the gentleman had the goodness not to tread on it. So that was Mrs. Norman Walker.
St. George's is a town filled with the good, the bad, and the ugly. A friend of the Walkers and an acquaintance of Rainey's becomes infamous as Dr. Black Vomit, America's first bioterrorist.
The horrid tale of Dr. Luke Blackburn, who came to Bermuda. He was trying to help yellow fever victims.
The Confederates will win. I am sure of it.
Yes, with your good work, sir. If you can find a cure for yellow fever, I believe we can beat the damn Yanks.
During the summer of 1864, yellow fever reached Bermuda with devastating effects. What emerged, however, was that far from being this Good Samaritan, Blackburn was in fact drawing money from the Confederate agents. He took the soiled clothes from yellow fever victims who died, and he basically packed them in a trunk, hid them among clean clothes. He left those trunks with a St. Georgian boarding house keeper with addresses in northern seaports, and basically arranged for the boarding house keepers to hold on to these trunks and then at a certain signal forward them on to the addresses on these trunks. What Blackburn was trying to do is send yellow fever infected clothes to foment an epidemic of yellow fever in Philadelphia and New York. We now know that yellow fever is spread by mosquitoes, not transmitted like, say, smallpox on clothing. So his scheme ultimately would have failed. But when it was revealed, it was shocking, his attempt to resort to this biological warfare, to try quite late in the war to perhaps save the Confederacy from defeat. Allen caught wind of this.
Come in, Joseph. And how is your good wife?
We're getting through those books that you lent us. Our education is progressing nicely thanks to such kindness.
Good. And what do you have to report?
Last night, as you know, Dr. Blackburn was entertained at the Walker's house. Now, my notes say, at 6 p.m. he arrives at the home of Norman Walker. Their discussion covers blockade running losses, the state of affairs in Nassau, and the local dock dispute by the black workers, and the yellow fever epidemic. Covert references to
Allen reported it to Bermudian authorities, and the East End health agent stepped in, examined these 3 trunks, but then destroyed them because he did not want the infection to break out again. And so he destroyed the evidence that would be needed eventually to convict Blackburn successfully.
Blackburn was subsequently charged with attempted murder, but he took refuge in Canada, and for his pains or his sins, he ended up as the governor of Kentucky. So, in effect, politics does pay.
On the other side is a valiant tale of Bermudians in the Civil War. The story of the 40 black Bermudians who fight for the Union, and of the one who fights for glory and dies in pursuit of victory, Sergeant Robert Simmons.
Bermudians liked adventure. But there were notices published in the newspapers in Bermuda warning that they could be captured into slavery. And that was always a possibility. It's the sort of thing you'd expect Bermudians to do. If there's something interesting going on, go and be a piece of it.
Robert Simmons became a sergeant in the famed 54th Massachusetts Regiment, the first African-American infantry to serve the Union, commanded by Robert Gould Shaw. And as a sergeant, Simmons serves in the highest rank available to a black soldier. For those who meet him, he leaves an indelible mark.
A valuable soldier.
A brave man and of good education.
A young man of more than ordinary abilities who had learned the science of war in the British Army.
The 54th volunteers to serve as the front line in the attack on Fort Wagner in 1863, with many casualties. Robert Gould Shaw and Robert Simmons meet their end at age 26, and both are honored. Simmons is awarded a private medal for valor after his death as a captive in a local hospital.
One of the Negroes is a remarkably sprightly fellow from Bermuda, where he was educated as a soldier. His position is that of an orderly sergeant, but he has lost an arm and probably one leg will go. A third of the glory for which he says he came to fight, being thus amputated, he will in future be a wiser man. Weekly Columbus Enquirer.
In the end, most Bermudians support the losing side, but those who die for glory on behalf of the Union will have victory. Simmons will not die for naught.
The gallant Cornubia left the harbor today, and we fear for its safety. It's the same ship that brought my family safely here, and which made the crossing several times unharmed. We fear for what seems to be increasingly bad news for our side.
I have news of a similar situation in Nassau, where the Union blockade is growing in number and ability.
How our hearts rejoice in the prospect of hearing any news from Dixie. But just this morning, I heard upon awakening our son Norman's voice outside my door, "Mother, the Emily is burnt and the D is lost." Oh, those terrible sounds, will they ever cease? Deo Vindiki, God will judge.
Now, dearest, let's not dwell on our losses. Well,
by late 1864, the writing was on the wall. And in January 1865, Fort Fisher, which guarded the entrance to the Cape Fear River, fell to a northern capture, which basically cut off access to Wilmington.
On April 15, 1865, after the curtain rises on the play Our American Cousin, Abraham Lincoln is shot. His assassination marks the end of a chapter in the history of the United States.
Monday, the 24th of April, 1865, was the saddest day of my life. With what terrible force came that crushing blow? Our country no more. We are conquered, overpowered by numbers. Might has triumphed. My heart sickens and I feel that this weight of woe is almost too much for us to bear. There is but one comfort left to us. God reigns and looks upon his fearful hour. If this be his will, we must submit. I shall, in afterlife, look back with much pleasure upon our life in this beautiful island in the midst of the sea. How quickly time passes.
They refused to load the ships, and I spent all day recruiting.
After the war, the workers went to England, lived there for many years, then finally returned and lived on Staten Island. Joseph Hayne Rainey and his wife returned to Charleston, and he was elected a member of the House of Representatives from South Carolina. Went up to Washington and was the first black man to be sworn in as a member of the House of Representatives.
Under God's providence, we will become a great and equal nation.
He was also, we're very proud to say, a member of Alexandrina Lodge. And after President Lincoln was assassinated in the United States, this lodge, Alexandrina Lodge, adopted a resolution of condolence, which was in fact seconded by Mr. Rainey. We have that very important connection with him.
Rainey's ally, the persecuted Charles Allen, is the only one to remain in Bermuda, continuing as the U.S. consul. He grows to love the island until his death in 1888. And the mouse returns to the quiet economy of supporting the British garrisons until the beginning of another era. The end of the 19th century brought a new Bermuda, the land of the lily and the rose, and begins a marketing campaign of breezy groves, coral caves, and lovely vistas of blue waters, as Mark Twain describes. What becomes known to wealthy Americans as nature's fairyland. It attracts luminaries including Georgia O'Keeffe, Eugene O'Neill, Winslow Homer, along with many American presidents.
The seed was sort of sown in American minds that this was a nice place. This was a garden in the Gulf Stream that was waiting for Americans. We had the growth of affluence in America. Bermuda beckoned. The Union Jack flew here. There were British officers. These sorts of things in the 1860s and 70s started bringing Americans out here into the mid-Atlantic as a winter resort. And it was popularized by very eloquent and well-placed Americans, and most famously Mark Twain, who came here starting in the late 1860s for their winters. Twain loved Bermuda, and he came very frequently, would come until months of his death.
As the sun shines on the azure waters of Bermuda, peace stretches from one side of the Atlantic to the other, until a cloud in Europe draws the world into a new dark age. Gavrilo Princip shoots the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, killing him and sparking the war to end all wars.
The United States and Britain always, for one reason or another, on the brink of war. But then World War I brought them together.
During the First World War, Bermudians actually formed their own militias. Contingents went overseas to serve in France in particular and in other theaters.
In 1917, Americans set up the first United States naval base on White's Island. And there they had a flotilla of submarine chasers.
World War I renews America's interest in Bermuda.
By war's end, a new industrial society had emerged, one made in a modern image, one made through changes.
After the war, the American Senate proposes that Britain give Bermuda to the U.S. as a partial repayment of war loans. But the mouse escapes the lion.
Former American President Taft, who wrote of Bermuda, never in global history has such a small country played such a large role in international affairs. And he was right. We've played a disproportionately large part on the world stage through accident of geography.
Meanwhile, Bermuda's tourism continues to grow in popularity as an escape from the industrialization of the U.S. and from the building tensions in Europe.
In the glory days of the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, the ships and the planes simply arrived. There was one little secret here that they didn't talk about very much. And that was, of course, America got prohibition in World War I and kept it through the 1920s and 30s. Bermuda never had prohibition, rule of the day. But you could come in the 1920s to Bermuda and drink. And that was an added attraction in the age of the flapper.
Bermudians yet again profit from the frictions in the politics and law of the U.S. Prohibition is part of the protectionist spirit of the times, where Americans favor splendid isolationism, far from a world on the doorstep of a war. Relations between nations change forever, and Bermuda again morphs into a military base. The island's budding tourism is put on hold. The mouse comes to play a key role in a battle for the Atlantic at a crucial turning point in the Second Allied War on Germany.
They were hitting hard all over the map.
Winston Churchill asked for immediate assistance as a matter of life and death. The 1935 Neutrality Act prevented the United States from giving any arms to a belligerent nation or a nation that was at war.
The very famous bases for destroyers deal that was brokered between Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Britain, and President Franklin Roosevelt of the United States.
This deal was signed on September 2nd, 1940. They thought that the best thing to do was to give these destroyers to Great Britain. And they did that.
Bill number 1776, another Declaration of Independence.
But they also requested a quid pro quo. And Roosevelt was quite savvy about how he did that, recognizing that he had to satisfy isolationist sentiment. He got a couple of the bases, one of them being Bermuda, to actually be given freely from the British to the United States. And there was no doubt that Germany was considered the enemy by the Roosevelt administration.
The United States needed to protect the eastern seaboard. Bermuda was right smack dab in the center. So she needed Bermuda more than anything else.
A delegation of Bermudian political leaders and businessmen went to London to appeal to Churchill about the decision to allow the Americans to have bases here. He said, given the gravity of the situation, everybody had to do their part in the war against the Nazis. And he encouraged them by saying Bermuda would become a pillar in a great transatlantic bridge linking the two major English-speaking democracies, the United States and the United Kingdom. And Bermuda had to come out of its shell.
I trust that our work here will not in the end go unrewarded. Thank you very much indeed. Good luck to Bermuda.
Interestingly enough, at the beginning of the war, there was a poem that enjoyed a certain vogue. The poem was called "There Are No Islands Anymore." Dear Islander, I envy you. I'm very fond of islands too. And few the pleasures I have known, which equaled being left alone. Yet matters from without intrude at times upon my solitude. A forest fire, a dog run mad, a neighbor stripped of all he had by swindlers, or the shrieking plea for help of stabbed democracy. The tidal wave devours the shore. There are no islands anymore. If Britain had fallen in 1940, which very nearly happened, the Nazi war machine, you have to remember, had conquered Czechoslovakia, had conquered Poland, had rolled across Belgium, Holland and France. And for a year or so, beginning in the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone against Hitler. The mind boggles at what fate might have befallen the people of this island. So Bermuda was dragged not only into World War II, but into the middle of the 20th century. The United States learned, as Bermuda did, that you couldn't isolate yourself from a global menace. And make no mistake about it, the Nazi regime in Germany had global ambitions.
There was certainly concern on behalf of the British and the United States governments that Bermuda could possibly be obtained by the Germans. It would have in fact been a very good move for the German Navy to take Bermuda because they could have used it as an outpost in their war against the United States.
Roosevelt wrote on his presidential papers to get troops there as soon as possible in the first months of 1941. The reason for that is that you had these German ships marauding through the Atlantic. Everything was by a hair back then, so you can understand the paranoia.
American forces rush into the East End and build up the fortifications of Bermuda in record time.
All the great forts that were built at Bermuda were built to defend Bermuda against an American invasion. They served that purpose well. But one of the great ironies of our history is in the Second World War, the Americans moved in to assume the coastal defense of Bermuda.
It was FDR and Churchill that both basically described Bermuda as a huge Anglo-American battleship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean.
Meanwhile, the census station had been set up.
In 1940, the Princess Hotel was requisitioned by the British government for an operation that was very grandly known as imperial censorship. What wasn't known to most people at the time is that all of the airmail that these flying boats carried was taken off the aircraft immediately when they docked at the Darrells Island flying boat base, taken to the Princess Hotel and opened and read by more than 1,000 censors. The role that Bermuda has played in the secret war, the espionage war, is not as well known today as it perhaps should be.
They were looking for information with regard to the spies in America especially.
If you can't read the enemy's mind, you can get a damn good idea of what he's up to by reading his mail.
I think I found something. Let's have a look. You should read it to me, out loud. Dear Lothar Frederick, I'm writing with the bad news that Phil has been killed while crossing Broadway at Times Square. He was hit by a car, purposely knocked over, and then promptly run over by another car. After such a tragedy, we've had difficulty getting back to business as usual. My aunt sold her store. It's not advisable to send her any more mail, but my other friends and relatives are still in business. Competition is very bad. Signed, Joe K. You should have the supervisors look at it, Nadia. It's too matter-of-fact to talk of someone's death that way. I've seen simple letters before from a Joe K. I can't stop thinking of that letter. Lothar Frederick. Lothar Frederick.
The censorettes would unseal mail and read it and reseal it very deftly. The censorettes couldn't speak about their work, but essentially everyone knew they were here.
So what's wrong? I can tell from a mile away. You seem different, unhappy.
Don't worry, it's not you, it's work that's bothering me.
And you sure it has nothing to do with me leaving to fight for the Allied cause?
Well, that upsets me more, of course, but I know I can't stop you from serving.
What's bothering you about work?
I'm not supposed to tell, I'm sworn to secrecy, but I found something that doesn't sit right with me, and no one else seems concerned. Well, it's just a hunch.
Well, you know what? We better be getting out of here before somebody sees us together.
Why are there so many injustices in the world?
After the war, you'll see that life will change for us.
Will I see you tomorrow?
Yes, tomorrow.
Many of the censorettes did end up marrying Bermudians or staying on to work here in other ways. And many of the censorettes became part of Bermudian society eventually.
War bride Margaret Mayer marries Bermudian Dudley Cooper after an international youth spent in France and Germany. and then a war career in Bermuda as a censorette.
I was born on the 8th of June, 1918. I went to Germany in 1938, while Hitler was still in power. Tante Lizzie and Uncle Carl had 3 children. Christian, who was an officer in the Wehrmacht, Renata, who married a U-boat commander, and Klaus. I stayed with them quite a long time. When you got on the train, you said Heil Hitler. When you got off it, you said Heil Hitler. Nobody said hello or how'd you do or good day. It was always Heil Hitler. That was their greeting. The Germans were never told the truth. And there was trouble brewing. And my father telephoned to say he thought I ought to come home. Well, I went to the government. They asked if I'd like to work in the censorship. I had to translate French and German letters and look for any information about the war. And if I found any, I had to make a submission to the Ministry of Information. We were all looking for spies.
What's happened to letter 5024 from Joe Kay to Lothar Frederick? I submitted it for further examination.
Yes, they tested it at your suggestion, but found nothing.
No invisible ink? No microdots?
They think you're reading too much into its simplicity. Now, we do appreciate you being thorough, but there is productivity to consider. Don't give it another moment's thought.
Did they use all the testing methods?
Yes, as far as I'm aware.
They were looking for various types of hidden messages, and the messages could be encoded in the text of letters. The other methods that were used were various types of invisible inks that would develop like a photograph when they were put into the proper chemical solutions. And also microdots, which were very, very tiny photographs of documents, reports, and these literally were used sometimes to dot I's in addresses that were typed on the front of envelopes.
I'm going now. Are you coming?
No, I think I'll finish off what I've left.
Are you sure? We're all going dancing at the Belmont tonight.
I'll give it a miss.
Always mysterious.
We had a department called Science and Testing. There's a girl called Nadia Gardner that worked in it.
And there was something about the construction, there was something about the way they were written which struck her as peculiar. She thought that perhaps they were written in a type of code. She ran them by the code breakers who were in place at the Princess Hotel. She still, for whatever reason, had suspicions about these letters from Joe Kay and decided to have them tested for invisible ink, for invisible writing. And eventually her suspicions proved to be extremely well-founded.
Not that Joe Kay business again. Well, what did they find?
You won't believe it. They found secret writing all over it about Allied shipping movements and military bases. And
what?
When they lifted the stamp, they found a code.
I have never seen anything like that before.
It reads 11-7-PFE. They're not sure what it means yet. They're still trying to figure it out. But they think it has to do with Allied planes or something.
You may have to give evidence.
Well, I'm prepared to do whatever necessary to catch them.
And she had to go up and testify in New York, and they caught them.
There was no question of the danger.
The Ludwig spy ring, which was a massive operation centered in New York, which saw Nazi spies literally tracking the movements of both warships and civilian convoys coming in and out of New York Harbor.
But my other friends and relatives are still in business. I hope you like the merchandise I sent you, and I hope it's what you want. All the time,
the information that she had uncovered was passed on to J. Edgar Hoover and the Federal Bureau of Investigation in the United States, which acted upon the information very rapidly. They broke up the spy ring.
The Battle of the United States took place in every community in the nation. It was a struggle against enemy agents who had been sent to this country to disrupt our industries, destroy our morale, and damage the impact of our fighting armies.
There was a very famous trial in New York City. The world became aware of the operation that was taking place here. God knows how many lives were saved, how many ships weren't sunk, as a result of this one lady poring over these letters, which just did not feel right to her.
In a better mood today.
I figured it out. I can't tell you details, but my hunch was right.
I just don't like it when I can see something's bothering you. And I'm worried about who's going to look out for you when I leave in a few days.
I can't bear to think of it.
I'm coming back. I promise.
I hope so.
In World War II, several contingents of Bermudians went overseas to serve. The Bermuda Militia Artillery, Bermuda Volunteer Rifle Corps, Bermuda Militia Infantry. Several groups joined the Caribbean Regiment, which was training in the United States, and they went on to Italy and Egypt. Many Bermudians joined forces independently, such as the Royal Air Force. 29 women left Bermuda to serve in the Second World War. Most went to Canada, but 1 or 2 went to the United Kingdom to serve in military units during the war.
A number of black Bermudians went overseas.
England needs help. I said to myself inside here that I would go just to see some other country, not thinking that I could get killed. That's the way I signed up to go overseas. I was 18 years old. I said, I'm volunteered to go overseas to fight in this war. You're going where? My daddy, he said to me, I don't have no property over there. I don't know Winston Churchill. I don't know Hitler. They taught us to kill. We knew how to do that. Where we were stationed, we was all just laying off on the ground, as to speak. No camp or nothing like that. The Germans came in that night and good. come back again. We were in the war. I knew what my mother said. She says, "Where is my wandering boy tonight?" That happened 3 nights straight. What is war? War is killing. It's blood. That's all you see is blood. Innocent people suffer from war. Why?
On Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
And a day or two later, Hitler declared war on the United States. That, of course, led to a huge acceleration of what was going on in Bermuda.
There was a constant stream of flying boats coming in and out of the Great Sound. They spent their time aloft tracking U-boats or keeping an eye out for them. The third U-boat sunk by the Americans, the Second World War, was sunk by a flying boat out of the Naval Operating Base in Bermuda. They broke through clouds one day, and there on the ocean surface was a U-boat which they bombed and sank.
We were a gathering place for convoys bound for England.
And what you have towards 1943 is the development of hunter-killer groups. These would be small carriers with shipping escorts, and they would be moving ahead of the convoys. And these became hugely effective. And again, though, it was all a struggle, sort of an 11th hour effort on the part of the Allies. You get this sense of menace out there. There's an awareness of the presence, and there's a very much hit and miss game going on, or a cat and mouse game. The Allies, or the American forces, really struggling to figure out how to fight U-boats. There were a lot of horror stories off Bermuda that there's not much history about, but very much a reality that was happening at the time.
As the tide of war is turning, Bermuda happens upon a top-secret mission and another chance to play a critical role. What is at stake is victory at Normandy.
It's a story of courage, compassion, intelligence gathering, in some ways vindication. Before D-Day in 1944, an American task force located a German submarine, the U-505, off the coast of Senegal, West Africa. The commander of the task force was a chap called Captain Daniel Gallery.
He was in command of a small aircraft carrier, the Guadalcanal, and his mission and orders were to capture intact a German submarine. They dropped depth charges. And the submarine surfaced. And the captain came on deck, and he could hear him say, "Take her down." So the Americans didn't want that, so they shot him with .30 caliber machine guns in the leg. And then the task force boarded the submarine.
For the first time since 1815, the United States Navy boards a foreign enemy man of war on the high seas.
You can see the bow of the submarine breaking water, and you can see a group of men near the conning tower of the submarine, and they're in distress. Their captain has been wounded.
It could not be towed to Senegal because German agents were operating there. And the only option was to tow it 2,000 miles to Bermuda. This the Americans did under total secrecy. He warned each and every member of the crew of his aircraft carrier and the supporting destroyers that breaching this secret would result in capital punishment. And in the process of capturing her, of course, the Americans had seized the updated Enigma machine, the codes, the torpedoes, and all the signal equipment on board this U-boat. This was of immense value to the Allies, and it is said that from the information gathered from the 505, the Allies were able to locate and pinpoint rendezvous points of other German submarines.
It was top secret. They didn't report, in accordance with the Geneva Convention, that they'd captured him, because they didn't want the Germans to know that we had the code book. Because, as Winston Churchill said, in wartime, secrecy must be protected by a bodyguard of lies. But from then on, whenever a German submarine would surface to recharge its batteries, there'd be a destroyer waiting.
The capture of the boat meant that other U-boats were sunk, other Allied lives were saved. When they captured the 505, it was the United States' first capture of an enemy warship since the War of 1812. So what a wonderful connection that is for Bermuda. Here we are in Bermuda sending a fleet of ships up the Chesapeake, on board which is written the Star-Spangled Banner. And then 130 years later, by some twist of fate, the Americans tow into Bermuda the German submarine, the 505. The first warship they captured in enemy action since they had the White House burnt down by the British from Bermuda in 1814. And it doesn't get any better than that, does it?
World War II fundamentally changes Bermuda and the United States. As the lion and the mouse adjust to the post-war world, tourism reemerges and Americans return to holiday in nature's fairyland.
The major impact of Bermuda was the American presence here for 54 years. And the building of the airfield, the free use of which allowed us to engage in airplane tourism and to enter a almost golden age of tourism for 20 years after the war.
The product had to be kept top of the line in order to keep these people coming.
A lot of the time, you'll simply want to relax on the gorgeous beaches. Never have I seen sand so soft and pink. Do you like aquaplaning? We certainly do. And there's plenty of opportunity in the sheltered harbors. It's exciting, especially in tandem. Be sure to try it when you go. And as far as fishing, well, there are over 400 varieties to catch around Bermuda. We always charter one of these comfortable cruisers by the day.
Very shrewdly, Bermuda began putting in place the kind of legislation that made it attractive for companies to establish here. That pillar of the Bermuda economy began to grow and grow, whereas the tourism pillar remained rather static.
As the West enjoys the booming economy of the 50s, an undeclared war of lethal influence and proxy begins to boil in the political fallout of the World War.
Third major strategic role that Bermuda played was during the Cold War, which lasted from 1945 until the early 1990s.
It became very clear that the Soviet Union was beginning to impose a new threat of global proportions. The kind of noises that Stalin was making in the late 40s was enough to warrant US, Canadian, and British military planners to determine that the Soviet Union was the primary concern. Suddenly, things start to ramp up. In the 1950s, the big change was that nuclear weaponry had been introduced into the arsenals of the United States, but also the Soviet Union. Suddenly you had two superpowers facing each other with these budding arsenals.
This included redeployment of air defense units to better defend the eastern coast, to ready them if the go signal is given. Both ADC and SAC aircraft are dispersed to assure survival of the force should the Soviet Union decide to attack.
We flew our sub-chasers out of Bermuda and tracked every single Russian submarine in the Central Atlantic.
P-3 Orions were on the front line of defense as far as the United States were concerned.
And so Bermuda became an important cog in the US playbook.
The base probably became as important then as ever before. Bermuda was known as the anti-submarine capital of the world.
Bermuda actually earned the Strategic Air Command status in the 1950s. Strategic Air Command was the attack dog of the United States military at the time. It was the teeth that was going to destroy the Soviet Union. At one time, they had planes in the air 24 hours a day to attack on warning. The 1950s is very much dress rehearsals for the apocalypse. And you have these massive exercises going on in the air over Bermuda, where Bermuda is used as a refueling staging post to launch Armageddon against the Soviet Union. Very wild.
The base here was engaged in a cat and mouse operation for 20-odd years.
We do know from the post-Soviet releases that the Soviets saw Bermuda as being the front line of the US defense system. And so it's probably quite clearly the case that therefore were Soviet missiles pointed at Bermuda. during the heyday of the Cold War, because in any strategic planning, you'd want to take out your front line first.
The Cold War suddenly turned hot. Bermuda would have been gone in a heartbeat. It wasn't until some confidential US military documents were leaked to the press in the mid to late 1980s that we suddenly woke up to the fact that we were on the front line. We were a tripwire in the global nuclear battlefield. I think on both sides, the recognition that nobody could actually win a nuclear war began to sink in. And the Cold War ended very quickly indeed.
It is the ending of a truly historic role for Bermuda.
Her Majesty's ship Dreadnought is the latest recruit to patrol the seas in the cause of peace, and may peace ever be her destiny.
The American tradition of holidaying in Bermuda becomes a casualty of the Cold War era. As the world opens up, the traveler's eye is lured beyond the island's pink beaches.
The old tourism is certainly dead and gone. Bermuda no longer attracts solely that cadre of tourists. Those people have moved on. You have to keep reminding people that this is a place you might like to come.
But Bermuda reinvents itself again. This time not in tourism, nor the battlefront, but into the world of international business. The island, however, does not leave its legacy behind.
The Bermuda motto in terms of, whether the fates lead us seems to sort of guide what we do. Every now and then there's a threat, there's an imbalance, there's a dislocation, and everyone says, oh my God, what next? And we typically find an answer. We now rank alongside London, New York, one of the top 3 centers of insurance and reinsurance in the world. A major force now.
Bermuda remains to this day an important pillar in the transatlantic bridge between Europe and the United States. Only role we play is markedly different now. We facilitate commercial interests rather than military ones.
2005, when the hurricanes hit the Gulf Coast, Bermuda paid out something like $22 billion in losses. Katrina, Wilma, and Rita, when they all sort of came one upon the other, and if you took away what Bermuda paid, you'd be short a lot of money. For the homeowner who goes and pays $3,000, there's a chain behind that they don't see. Without the support of markets like Bermuda, there's no way that capacity could exist. Or it would be available at a price they probably couldn't afford. We've grown from what was a niche player into a major player now in the international industries. Bermuda, we're cocky enough to think we're the lion, but we're not.
Bermuda is distinctive in changing with the times. You have a 17th century agricultural economy and an 18th century maritime economy and a 19th century military economy and a 20th century tourist economy. And it's not surprising that as we get into the 21st century, business becomes the new focus. It's betting against risk. And that is not that much different from what the mariners of the 18th century did. The corporate business in this global age in the 21st century has a lot of echoes of Bermuda's 18th century economy.
What I do for you, Daddy?
Hey, that's a good drawing, St. George. Did you do that at school?
Yes. Haley, grab me my pen, please. Here you go, Mom. Thank you, sweetie.
Dearest sister, have you settled in after your move to Virginia? My Haley misses you the most. Little St. George seems to have grown in the short weeks you've been gone. I'm enclosing pictures of them, and a lion which St. George drew at school. I miss you.
Bermuda is a magnificent story. It's an epic story. It's a story that's full of drama, both good and bad events taking place.
This man is hereby sentenced to death.
So Bermuda, yes, has on occasion been able to help the United States. I think in the beginnings when Summers and Gates arrived in Virginia and saved the colony, the American Revolution, when, say, large supply of gunpowder on the island shipped to the American forces, and the Enterprise slaves brought ashore to remain in Bermuda as free people.
Wish to remain here and be free.
So in these ways, we have, in our small and very weak way, we have been of help to the mighty king of the beasts, to the United States.
I think I found something. Let's have a look.
During the Second World War, of course, above all, our land given up to the United States as the German submarines swarmed over to this side of the Atlantic.
Signed, Joe K.
Little friends may be able to help big friends, yes.
Think of where we were then and what we are now.
What lies down the trail? Who knows? Something else, perhaps.
The lion says to the mouse, "The tidal wave devours the shore. There are no islands anymore."
Prospero's mythical island is now lost in the dark abysm of time. Bermuda's sailors become Bermuda's soldiers of fortune. Anon weaves a thread of Bermuda and America, the seventh act. In the fickle Atlantic wind, we ask the same question.
Quo fata furunt. Where will the fates lead us?
Will the lion and the mouse save each other again?
Bermuda.